That's very progressive. You don't often see these sorts of things happening while the war is underway. Usually, the international community waits till the war is over and then it starts to put together the pieces of a large scale mass claims restitution project, which takes years to assemble before it's ready to actually give people their land back. Well, that's a problem, right? What actually should be happening is what Ukraine's doing. You're starting before the war's over. You're getting ready now. You're opening the opportunity now. Gives a peace dividend to a local population to start to pursue things, right? Provides them options, provides business opportunities. We've seen some interest from both inside and outside Ukraine to create a little industry that makes prefab housing, right? Okay, so you've got a piece of land, your building's destroyed. I got a prefab housing company. You've got a voucher. I get the money. I go, there's your house, right? So you can get this thing, the machinery of it, going pretty quick if you got the laws in place, if you got kind of the mechanisms to actually make it happen in place. Ukraine does. It's really good to see.
Hello and welcome. Our guest this week on The Edge is Dr. John Unruh, and he is a professor of geography at McGill University in Montreal. He specializes in what war does to human demographics. He studies and speaks about the consequences of conflict when it comes to human suffering and the after effects of that on societies. And additionally, there are talks about what reparations will need to be made, reconstruction, how all of those will factor into any kind of negotiated peace settlement or a ceasefire. And, of course, at the end of the day, there is the question of who's going to draw the borders and what territories will be either won or lost. It is a complex and wide-ranging discussion, and I do believe that there is an awful lot to learn here. So, Professor, thank you very much for joining us here this week. You are an expert on kind of land rights. When you look at Ukraine, what most concerns you when we're talking about loss of those, land rights and the current situation with internally displaced people?
All right, so we've got there's a number of kind of currents that are coming together that make for a pretty complicated situation. One is the kind of we can call it the pre-invasion period when Ukraine was transitioning along a pretty rocky road away from its membership in the Soviet Union to something else, up until where we see it today, where it's pointed robustly into EU membership, which is its objective, its goal. So in that transition period, of course, it happened in fits and starts. Is it going to be Russian affiliated? Is it going to be more Western European affiliated, depending on the leadership, back and forth? And so in terms of land rights, of course, that meant land and property rights, land meaning agricultural land, etc., property meaning, even apartments that are non-movable property rights. Are we going to be collectivized? Are we going to go toward private property? Is it a hybrid? And so you had this situation where a lot of the technical staff and the bureaucracy was still Soviet era, and of that mindset, and either reluctant to move toward a more Western model of property rights, or just simply opposed it. And so even today, you've got some of that element there that it's a combination of not knowing how to grasp Western style property rights, or just being against it because it would detract from their own position and their history, in that position. So All of that was underway. A lot of turmoil. Do renters have rights? What about agricultural land, right? So broadly it was okay if you sit on the
Hmm.
land when we say go, we're dismantling the Soviet thing and it's yours or not, right? During this period, of course, international large scale agribusiness flood in and start gobbling up a lot of small scale land to the great concern of the government and of its rural constituencies. So there's a moratorium put on some of that. Large scale international agribusinesses are pretty smart. They can do workarounds to these things and did. And so a lot of undercurrents about how land rights are going to evolve and move forward.
Yeah.
And then bam, the Soviet Union or
And
Russia invades. Yeah, go ahead.
right. No, I also think it's worth making a point here for the audience who may or may not know that there are very different concepts of land ownership between Europe and Russia. And Ukraine, as you just outlined there, is kind of working its way, navigating, what it really wants to be. Is certainly during the period of time you're talking about there. But it's important to point out that, as I understand it, when I lived in Russia, that you don't actually land ownership, even post Soviet Union, is not something that is done. The vision that the Russians have of land ownership is very, very different than the Western version. In essence, the state is always the owner of the land. You can build on it. Back in the imperial days, you had serfs to work the land and kind of a plantation system. But the land itself was never owned by any individual, rich or poor. You just work the land for the czar. And that mentality, I think, has more or less stayed. I don't think they have actual proper land ownership in Russia. And so this is part of the differences we see between Ukraine and Russia, and one of the reasons why Ukraine is so fervent to break away. I don't know if I have that correct or if I've just misled folks, but I'll leave it to you to correct me if I did.
No, that's spot on. I mean, the mentality there, and you're speaking of it in that way of a mentality is at the crux of it, right? You can pass all the laws you want. You can roll out the police. You can do titles and deeds and documents and all that stuff of private property. But if the mentality still exists in a different mode, then it's not going to happen. So we've seen this in Africa where we've tried to kind of move things more toward a land market and private pro. That's great. You can do laws and titles and all the artifacts of a property right system. But if the mentality isn't going to shift, and sometimes it takes a generation or more to do, that would be quick. Then you're still stuck. In addition to creating kind of a mess by having this combination of older mentality but new artifacts, that creates opportunities for corruption and opportunism and things like that, which we do see in Ukraine, right? So you've got
Hmm.
people who don't really know how the titles and laws and deeds work. Others who do take advantage of those who don't. Some want to move forward, some don't. So it's a bit of a swirl of kind of different notions of what to do today. In the meantime, as we know, Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse, right? And so the stakes are kind of high in terms, just agriculturally, of how this goes. Particularly in terms of exports, right? I work a lot in Africa,
Hmm.
and it's amazing how much of Africa relies on Ukrainian grain. Egypt, big population there, does not have a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
agricultural land itself. Direct connection with Ukraine. So the food security of big chunks of the world are directly connected to this issue of what's Ukraine going to do in terms of just its agricultural land rights. Urban land rights, right? Particularly now in the experience of large scale forced displacement, destruction, damage of urban properties, separate issue, equally problematic, right? How do we compensate or restitute people's rights to to their shelter. Made even more complicated by, of course, Ukraine's desire to get into the EU, which very much upholds human rights, and the human right to shelter and your property is a primary one. So, got to adhere to that. How to do
Mm-hmm.
that? Well, that means everyone who's been displaced gets a restitution right in some way. You get your property back, you get another one back. If you can't get that one back, you get compensation back. You get a remedy in some way in order to put the claim to rest, multiplied by the millions of claims that you've got, and Ukraine's got a big problem, a big issue to try to handle. It's got a lot of advantages over other countries in moving toward this kind of restitution of land and property rights juggernaut problem that it's doing. It's a pretty advanced society. It's very digitally literate, as we know. The current government's very progressive in passing laws that will enable, right, restitution to go on. It's very realistic, very pragmatic. So what we often see in war affected countries for land and property rights is people try to get their land back. They do it on their own. They do it in
Mm-hmm.
small patches, piecemeal places, and so you have like you have in Ukraine, a law society in some corner of the country saying, okay, for our jurisdiction, our area, we'll take your claims and engage in restitution. That's one thing. The other thing is maybe the Italian government has cut a deal with the municipality to do restitution there, right? Maybe a church takes it on in a different place. So you've got this patchwork of restitution efforts go on, right? What you don't
Mm-hmm.
want, what we've seen in the past, unfortunately, is for the UN or a big actor to come in and say, everybody stop. Never mind all the claims that you've addressed so far, reapply under our game, our internationally sanctioned kind of clearinghouse mass claims approach. Okay, to Ukraine's credit, I think it's realizing that these this small patchwork of restitution efforts are viable, should stay, and the effort should be to stitch them together somehow into a national game, as opposed to trying to erase
Mm-hmm.
them, stamp them out, and say, never mind. People don't do that. They're not going to apply twice to another restitution effort, particularly when they're busy rebuilding their lives based on the previous one. So
Yeah.
it is good to see, very heartening to see in the Ukraine context that they're really taking on some of these realities very seriously and are being very progressive. I think the international community has a lot to learn from some of the ways that Ukraine is handling this.
How optimistic are you that the people displaced from the invasion, the 2014 invasion that we were about to get into there, before we had our little chat about land rights in Russia and in Ukraine. But how optimistic are you, do you think, that they will get any restitution or have their property returned to them?
Right. So it's I think it's probably, you could probably have a pretty good feeling of optimism that they will get a remedy. Will they get their property back? Big question mark. Okay, so if you play that scenario forward where Russia in some way has influence, or has sold your land or property in the area it's now occupying multiple times, so that now there's a current occupant who, I don't know, got it in good faith. You'll never get it back, let's say. It's still important to open a claim
Mm-hmm.
to that property, so that you get a remedy of some sort. Maybe you don't personally don't
Mm-hmm.
get it, but maybe your descendants do. Something along the lines of, current day Holocaust era claims. They're still being played out. Well, it's the descendants that are pursuing and benefiting from that. So Ukraine's a pretty sensitive place to the feelings of its constituencies, and that's a big one, the one that has been displaced from the eastern Russian occupied area. So I feel pretty optimistic that some sort of equation will be put together for them so that remedies will be eventually forthcoming. So I mentioned that it was good to open a claim to a piece of property you may never see again. There's another reason to do that,
Mm-hmm.
other than your descendants may get a remedy. And that is that, en masse, all those claims creates a very large debt on the part of the current occupant, Russia. That debt can be useful. That debt can, and it has in other circumstances, influenced the conduct of the war, and it's influenced the conduct of the peace process, peace negotiations. Okay, so let's wave our arms and say at some future date, we have peace negotiations underway. If there's a very large debt of mass claims to people that want that land back, that's part of the equation. That's part of what we're talking about in a peace accord. How are you going to handle that? That can be useful on the part of Ukraine to have that large open debt, right? Realizing you may never get it back, but that needs in some way to be paid, addressed, dealt with, etc. That's another, it's another point of leverage, right, on the part of a future Ukraine negotiating for as much as it can in a peace arrangement. So there's a couple levels of utility to claiming land that you may never get back because it's in the Russian occupied areas. A, you may get a remedy. Your descendants may get a remedy. That's an individual benefit. B, broadly, Ukraine may benefit by having a very large amount of open, unattended to claims that will have to be dealt with by the international community, and usually by the belligerent actor, in this case Russia, will have to kind of take that on. So that's two reasons to actually do that. It's unfortunate now that those areas, the Russian occupied East, is not included in the current compensation law that Ukraine has. Right? It maintains that those areas are dealt with under a previous law, which unfortunately is quite weak and is not doing the trick. And there's no real open invitation or even mechanism to file a claim for those properties. And I would argue there should be. Either Ukraine or international actors should start to take on those claims and say, here's the reason for it. Right? So that's the kind of Eastern occupied areas. Elsewhere in Ukraine, bit of a different story in terms of how things are unfolding.
Yeah, well, before we move on to the unoccupied parts that are being damaged by Russia, even though they don't hold it. I'm sure that you're aware of the situation in places like Mariupol, where they flattened it, but then they've kind of done this Potemkin village kind of quick rebuilding of certain areas, and they are literally selling them off to Russians. There's a whole market. There's a television show, I even believe, that like does property hunting in Mariupol. So, certainly the Russians are under the impression that this land is now theirs and it's not going anywhere. Do you get that same impression from the Russian side of the equation, that they're like, no, this is a done deal, this is ours now?
Exactly. Yeah. So, but that does not erase the prospect of someone having an open and unattended to claim for an apartment on the 12th story of a destroyed and replaced building that no longer exists. You have to prove, and that's easily done, that you were a resident there. Right. So Syria did this in its war. It would do things like change the street names so that your title with a street name on it no longer was recognized, and then sell the property to Iranian citizens that came in. So that's a known endeavor in a post-war scenario, that there's this erasing attempt of former property rights, and you get in there and it creates a bit of a dilemma because Russia creates a new high-rise building, sells the 12th floor apartment to what's called it's a good faith purchaser. So that good faith purchaser, Ukrainian, Russian, whoever, does have legitimate rights to that, right? So you can't really kick the person out, right? But you've got an open claim there for what no longer exists but used to. Okay, and so there are ways to basically prove you used to be there, even though visibly now you're not, and somebody else has your property. So this is where kind of alternative remedies come in. Okay, and those remedies in other circumstances have been greatly broadened to include other things besides property. So the easy ones are, okay, you lost the property there. We'll build you a new one here. You get it for free. Alternative housing, land, and property, right? That's an easy one. Compensation. Here's some money, right, to pay you for it. But other things are brought to bear too. How about your kid goes to the best school in the country for free? How about you're in line to get a good job? How about so you can come up with all sorts of remedies. And in some cases, the beneficiary, the claimant, gets to pick and choose. I tailor my own remedy solution. I want school, I want job, I want a little bit of compensation, right? And so you can actually do that now. And so broadly, the idea behind a restitution endeavor, because you're dealing with hundreds of thousands to millions of claims, is to put as many claims to rest as possible, decrease the volume. So you want to go from what, 10 million to 2 in some way. So who's willing to accept what? Okay. So part of what we're seeing is, some of the experimentation that the Balkans wars did. Okay, you get compensation, says the government, and you get this amount. We don't have it now. We may have it in the future. Here, sign on the document on the dotted line here saying that in a future date you may get it. Okay, so you sign that document. Your claim is now done. You don't have another claim. That's what it wants, right? So another way is to work in installments. We have a little bit of money now for everybody. We're going to pay you 100,000 whatever currency. We have 20 today, so we're going to pay you in installments when we get it. Where we're going to get it from, international community, future economic productivity, from the belligerent actor, et cetera. And so you pay compensation in installments. So as you can imagine, there's a wide variety of kind of remedy
and you would write that into kind of any peace accord or even a ceasefire, any kind of signed document that kind of in any way kind of either is a ceasefire or a peace accord. As I say, these are two different things, but like you would work that in. That's where the legislation would be worked in. Is that, have I got that right? Or where would this be put down in ink and paper?
Yeah, in part. So peace accord is between belligerent actors. If money flows from one primary belligerent actor, Russia in this case, then yeah, it would say for compensation. But operationalizing that would be domestic legislation later, right? So you would, and what often happens, and Sudan did this in an earlier incarnation, you say, oh, yeah, this one part of the peace accord, land rights, is so difficult, it's so volatile. What we're going to do is park it till later. So the peace accord says we're going to create a land commission to sort all this out later, just so you can get the signatures on the peace accord. Now, you have to follow up and actually do that. If you don't, things get.
We'll do the fine. Yeah, we'll do the fine. The fine kind of print at a later date. But we both agree that you, Russia, have got to. We've got to figure out how to work this out. Is that where
exactly?
Have I understood?
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on this by any means. So I'm trying to get clarification.
Right. Well, you would set up that Russia pays into a fund, and then, the exact nature of the compensation or remedy would be domestic, domestic law later, of course, with a strong international influence. The international community likes to have influence in these things. There's human rights to pertain to. There's return of refugees, large numbers of refugees that can create political problems, Poland, Germany, that would like to see, Ukrainians and Syrians return, right, for their own political concerns. So they're going to have an influence. They're going to be pushing Ukraine to conduct restitution in a certain way. That would be subsequent to a peace accord. Although you do see some of that pushing now, certainly in Syria and in for Ukrainian refugees as well, right? It's safe here or there. Reconstruction is happening where you're from. Can you please consider, voluntarily, of course, that's a human right, going home and rebuilding, right? So large numbers of refugees in adjacent countries do have political issues they raise, particularly if they're there over time and the host population starts to think about jobs and services and X, Y, and Z. In other words, their benevolence to hosting refugees kind of runs out of steam, right? After so many years and so many refugees and so much hardship, the host population can think, we need to start pushing for a new scenario. And so you'll have a strong
So
international
that they can,
influence,
yeah,
but in this
so they can go
domestic
home.
effort to get people some remedy, right?
Yeah. I wonder if you could weigh in on a debate that I have heard expressed, and that is that in one way, these conquered territories, because there's been so much fighting, and they will be, it's going to take a lot of cost to rebuild them. They're going to get a whole bunch of new citizens that are going to include, like, they're going to need pensions and, the care for the elderly and recreate the infrastructure, hospitals and whatnot. So it's almost kind of this, as I say, albatross around their neck. But then alternatively, also, I have heard the argument made that yet at the same time, they are robbing the place blind. Anything that isn't nailed down. So they are this is a theft that benefits Russia, not only in terms of tangible material you can take, but those land property rights. And if they're behind the Russian border, Russia being Russia and its kind of relationship with the international order can just say, go pound sand. This is now Russian territory, and not only are we not going to give it back, but we're going to strip it bare. Which one of these two things is the Donbass for Russia? This cutting off your nose to spite your own face, or they're getting everything out of it that they can possibly rip away. What do you think?
Yeah, really, really important issue. These things to be intertwined. So, let's say in some magical future scenario, you get your property back as a Ukrainian dislocatee. Well, are you going to go home if there's no infrastructure? Are you going to go home if there's no schools or grocery stores or roads or water or electricity? So, yeah, you may on paper be due your farm back or your house back, but you're not going back if there's no livelihood infrastructure there because it's all been stripped bare and sold and carted off. So that's an added dilemma, right? And so is that restitution? Western European law would probably say, don't think so, Ukraine. If you want into the EU, you've got to do a little more than just hand out documents saying, yeah, you get your land back, go get it. Good luck to you making a living, right? Because everything's just been stripped and short. So that adds an extra dilemma into that. It actually puts pressure on an alternative remedy that would be experienced in Western Ukraine for someone dislocated from the East. I'm not going back, but I am due something. I get a chunk of money, compensation, that allows me to go here or there and buy, rent, whatever, an alternative piece of property. You do see this kind of stripping down, in terms of assets. Part of that is, depending on how you're thinking about it, could be that, that they're afraid that in fact they won't be able to keep it, right? And if you're afraid you won't keep it, what you're going to do is mine it today. You're going to take as much out as you can today. You're going to, as you say, strip it bare, cart it away. Just in case you don't get to keep it, at least you got something, right? You see that in conflicts as well. And that can be actually a purposeful doubt to try to put into the minds of others. In an earlier phase of the Darfur War, we actually saw that. President Bashir was indicted by the ICC. So I was in Darfur when that happened. It was amazing to see the change in narrative. Now the Janjaweed was starting to think, ooh, we actually may not be able to keep the lands that we conquered. They weren't afraid they were themselves were going to be indicted, but because that message is there, it introduces doubt. They change the behavior of the conflict. So, arguably that tinkering with narratives and doubt and these things. It's a weapon, right? Both sides use. It's a civil society tool that you want the opponent civil society to think things, right? That would advantage your side in the war. So you could read it as that. They're stripping it and carting it away because they're still not sure about their ability to actually keep it. Never mind the verbiage and the declarations and the slamming of the fists on the table. We'll never give it. All that stuff, right? That all of that comes and goes quickly. So you can read that in a couple of different ways if you want.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You spoke briefly about the political pressure that's going to be brought to bear because, you do have mass displacement internationally. You mentioned refugees, and I don't think it's just limited to neighbors. I think um, there are issues with Ukrainian refugees all throughout the West. I know Canada has taken in a fair bit. A lot of European nations have. The Irish, I think, are starting to limit it because they are concerned about this. But then internally within Ukraine, you have internally displaced people, the IDPs. My question is about the pressure that is put on Ukraine by its internally displaced people, but then also the refugee situation. How much of this builds up to a breaking point where it's like we have got to, whatever it is, we've got to end the war, we've got to outline a reparations program. What is the political pressure that comes to bear on countries when there is this mass migration due to conflict?
Yeah, really, really good question. So it's usually it hits the government at the very top. It's the president and those people that are surrounding that individual because this is a government to government issue. So the government of Poland says, "Wow, a lot of Ukrainians been here for a long time. We've done our best. We've provided for them, etc." We're starting to get political difficulty now from the Polish population that says, enough. There aren't enough services and schools and jobs, etc. And of course, you can imagine that that's right to have a political element emerge that takes advantage of that. Of course, as they always do. Immigrant bad, local board good. Let's create a
Mm-hmm.
division there. Vote for me, support me, and all X, Y, and Z to these immigrants, to these refugees. Send them home, etc. So it rumbles up from below. It gets to the top, and you'll have the Polish leadership talking to the Ukrainian leadership. Look, move now. We need to do something now, or appeal to the international community. More money, right? Or like Lebanon passed pretty draconian laws saying, in their case, Syrian refugees can't work, can't go to school, can't, in order to kind of preserve the economics and the livelihoods of Lebanese. So that creates its own problem. If you surround refugees with too many can'ts, then you're creating a pretty volatile bubble there that's going to have its own problem. So what to do is a pretty big issue. These are cases where the numbers are large and they've been parked in adjoining states for quite some time. And the constituency there of the native born are starting to think, wow, this isn't going to end up soon. And so where are we headed here? So they start to be unhappy about it. A politician emerges, says, "Follow me. I'll do bad guy, good guy, immigrant, local game." That we currently see, in a number of places. And so it gets difficult quick, right? So there's pressure. So the pressure can have a couple of manifestations. One is, look, pass the laws you need to get local people compensation or remedy so that they go home. So we can announce among the Ukrainian
Mm-hmm.
population in adjoining country X or Y, look, you've got a remedy waiting for you back in Ukraine. You've got an alternative flat, alternative farm, alternative job. There you go. Please take it up, right? And invite them to return. That can also manifest itself in economic assistance. Let's economically invest in the rebuilding of Ukraine so refugees go home, right? That could be one way to kind
Yeah.
of handle that kind of pressure. So you will see a lot of pressure from the West, and of course Ukraine continues to want to belong to the EU. So it's likely gonna attend to that in some way. And again, they see the logic in doing that. So and that EU membership is a very, as
Yeah.
I'm sure you know, strong carrot currently for the government and the population of
Yeah.
Ukraine as well.
It would incentivize a lot of people to return to Ukraine. I mean, one of the worst things that I've seen is where refugees or IDPs get caught in a limbo status.
Exactly.
And they're especially when it's international and it's a refugee situation where you have a population that's been expelled and they are now living on foreign territory. Do you give those people like the same rights and citizenships and basically integrate them into your country, or do you keep them as a refugee status so that it incentivizes them to return home eventually? Anyhow, this is a very tricky game, and I've seen it played out in a lot of different countries, and I'm deeply
Yeah.
worried about it in Ukraine. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing and sharing those concerns.
That is a very large concern. There's a silver lining to that, right? It manifests itself a couple of years later after the end of a conflict, which is that if you had a lot of refugees in your country and the war is over and a good number of them go back, okay, what you have now are extremely strong linkages between your hosting country and that refugee country. A couple of years after the war, those start to bear fruit, those linkages, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
business connections, in terms of opportunities between countries. So you see often, it goes unreported, an economic bump, right? Even with the host country, because they now have access to all sorts of things inside Ukraine because they know the folks that went back. And these folks, of course, over
Mm-hmm.
time get into business, they get into government. And I knew you when you were a refugee in my town, and I'm going to call you up because I got a business thing I want to do in your. And so those connections tend to bear fruit and tend to create kind of an economic bump, right? That benefits both countries. And so that unfortunately comes along after. It's not super visible. It's not something the media reports on. Business does enjoy that, right? Particularly small scale business, entrepreneurship. I got a trucking company. You got some agriculture. Let's get together, right? So there's all sorts of smaller scale things economically that actually benefit from those links, those connections forged during a refugee experience, right? West Africa knows it really well and really is good at benefiting from that. Some of the cross-border interactions that go on there now, economically, very robust that goes on. But again, you don't see it. See it meaning reported in the media, read about it a lot in day-to-day news, but it's there. Politicians in hosting countries would do better to make a bigger thing of that to their hosting populations, right? You've got in your face, by hosting all these refugees, a future economic opportunity, right? So let's build
Yeah.
that. Let's make those connections. So that's the silver lining that's there now in kind of what up front right in our face now is a problem, right?
I want to circle back to that, but before I do, I want to ask, and I'm only going to take up just a more period of time of yours, and again, thank you for coming on. Um, uh, is what about the rights of those? So we talked a little bit about like if the battle lines were to be hardened now, and the border is as it stands where the troops stand now. Yes, it might be more difficult and more complicated when it's on the other side of the border in what Russia holds and now claims as its territory, because of course they have, it's going to be tough to draw that out of Moscow. But there are those who live in Ukraine, Ukrainians who have had their homes destroyed, and they're still territorially that territory is still in Ukraine, but the damage was done by Russia. What about their rights? What about their possibility for compensation if they're domestically still in a sovereign Ukraine, but they're dealing with, a still pretty antagonistic Moscow?
Right. Well, that would be among the highest priorities currently, right? That area that they're currently in, right, and that they had a loss in property from in Ukraine, in a future EU member, they have a human right to property to that property, restitution, compensation, rebuilding, etc. So their attention would be probably at the top of the list. It's most doable. Their property's there, they're there. The equation's cleanest, right? There's not a secondary occupant who took over your house and sold it 12 times, five up, that kind of thing.
There was a Russian missile. It struck my building. You owe me money. At the
somebody owes
very
you
least,
something. There's that. That's
Yeah.
right. So whether that money comes from Russia, from the
Yeah.
international community, from some perk or benefit you get out of a future Ukraine, it's connected to that loss. That's a human right. And so you can bet Western Europe is going to be pressing that, as it does, right? And to attend to those. Ukraine's current compensation law is doing a pretty good job at creating the legal constructions for that. Okay, so it has a variety of compensation, alternative land, etc. Bit cumbersome, and it wants a variety of surveys to verify X or Y. It could be doing more in a transitional justice, it's called, context, actually prove or verify people who used to live there, right? But once you've done that, then there's a whole digital pathway that's open now to actually lodging your claim. And so that kind of machinery's there. That's good to see, right? That's very progressive. You don't often see these sorts of things happening while the war is underway. Usually, the international community waits till the war is over, and then it starts to put together the pieces of a large-scale mass claims restitution project, which takes years to assemble before it's ready to actually give people their land back. Well, that's a problem, right? What actually should be happening is what Ukraine's doing. You're starting before the war's over. You're getting ready now. You're opening the opportunity now.
Mm-hmm.
Gives a peace dividend to a local population to start to pursue things, right? Provides them options, provides business opportunities. We've seen some interest from both inside and outside Ukraine to create a little industry that makes prefab housing, right? Okay, so you've got a piece of land, your building's destroyed. I got a prefab housing company. You've got a voucher. I get the money. I go, there's your house, right? So you can get this thing, the machinery of it, going pretty quick if you got the laws in place, if you got kind of the mechanisms to actually make it happen in place. Ukraine does. It's really good to see.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. You talk about the messaging, which could be better when it comes to like, hey, actually, these displaced people who are currently, maybe temporarily, in your nations, when they return, hopefully, to Ukraine, that this will create bonds and trade and connections and all those things. That's the good messaging that if I understand you correctly, you'd like to see more of. But also at the same time, those refugees, the burden on their neighboring states or whatever, what have you, that's a narrative that Moscow wants to push out. So what I suppose I'm asking is, how can we bolster the actually having Ukrainians more integrated to Europe is in the long run going to be a good thing, as opposed to Moscow's pressuring of Western democracies, because they like to disrupt, they like to put pressure on democracies, and what better way to do that than using migration as a weapon, which we know that they do in a variety of different ways. What do you think is the more possible narrative that will find more traction? It's good to have Ukrainians integrated, or those Ukrainians are just sucking you dry.
Yeah, well, under Moscow's narrative, it's hard to see if that one prevails. how in fact any refugee would want to return to Ukraine. So that narrative is that, oh, look, all these Ukrainians are sucking you guys dry. Why not end the war now? Well, let's say that happened. They're not coming back because Russia's in charge.
Hmm.
I guess from the Western European point of view, it would be pretty good to shoot that one down. Um, are they doing it? Are they actually coming out and trying to cripple the Russian narrative among their own populations? Probably could do more. Probably could also do more to kind of pursue this silver lining, right? Okay, the Ukrainians are here. They want to be into the EU. When they're in the EU, my understanding is that they can travel around and get work in different places anyway. So if we admit them to the EU, they're still going to be able to show up and go to school, ask for a job, etc. That's kind of the idea behind the EU movement, right, within member states. So the idea now is to try to manage it. I mean, and several cities have tried different things. Let's put them all in one place, and we'll keep them there, and we'll provide services, and that's the best thing to do. Another one, no, let's scatter them around, right? It'll lessen the load on everybody, easier to integrate into schools, jobs, housing, etc., and it'll be a lighter touch, but over a broader area. So there's a couple of different ways to kind of manage a large refugee population. If you see them being a strength, an advantage, right, then it might be good to kind of spread them around. Okay, you've got some issues there. Well, they speak Ukrainian, they don't speak German. Now what? Okay, so there is a period of time there where there's integration in order to actually take advantage of these links. So the linkages and the economic benefits come down the road a little bit in the order of years. They've got a year learn Italian or German. You've got to
Hmm.
figure out who they are. The kids have to grow up together. They've got to innovate together, etc. You've seen some extremely successful innovations that go on between German and Ukrainian university students. Okay, it's hot innovation
Hmm.
there, particularly in terms of the app world, right? That allows Ukrainian refugees or this population or that population with apps to actually, engage the world in a really robust way, right? One of these, I don't know if the app came from Germany or not. It's called RefUnite. It's an app, right? So usually, what happens
Hmm.
in a war where you've got large scale dislocation, family members just get scattered. They get separated. And then this family member ends up in that refugee camp. This family ends up in another refugee camp. And then whoever's running the camp posts big paper lists of people that are in another camp. And as a refugee, you go up to that list every day because there could be a new page on it. And you look for your family members. Oh, I found one. Now my family member's in refugee camp way over there. I go tell the camp commissioner, please reunite us. Well, the UNHCR still does that, but now there's this app, RefUnite, right, which just outruns that whole process. It allows the refugees themselves to come up with ways to do family reunification. Where are my family members? Where are my kin? Not just in other refugee camps, but loose on their own in some city. Oh, you're in Istanbul. I see. So this is really interesting. This, the innovations that can go on between refugees
Hmm.
and host country nationals is amazing. It's an economic opportunity. Again, I'm arguing that not enough is being made of that opportunity going forward, particularly with, there's some cultural affinity between Ukraine and Western Europe, right? In terms of
Yeah.
a broad variety of things. So it's a real advantage. I think Western Europe's going to realize it, like it or not, later on. It's just you tend to get concerned about what's right in front of your nose today. Too many Ukrainians, right?
Yeah.
Not enough room in schools,
Yeah.
not enough whatever, right? So you're kind of blind to the future, which your own children are going to be a part of. So in that regard, my own thinking is if you maximize exposure between refugees and the host population, that's what's going to juice up or incentivize this innovation and linkage, economic linkage in the future. right? Not keeping them all together in one camp
Yeah.
and say, okay, now go home, right? So that it's a large, complex problem with ups and downs.
Well, I think you're spot on there. I mean, if there is a silver lining in all the awfulness of this war, is that the world is starting to see the inventiveness and the ability, the capability of the Ukrainian people, and how much of a benefit they would be in a European Union situation. I think we're on the same page there. One of the other things that I see here that gives me a glimmer of optimism and positivity is that there's another aspect of what happens here in Ukraine when something is damaged or destroyed. Notably, I think of like Bucha or Irpin, these suburbs of Kiev that were just ravaged in the beginning of the war. Well, if you go there now, they are beautiful suburbs. They have been rebuilt. Additionally, when other damage is done, I oftentimes see one of the first things that people do is that they instantly come out and start rebuilding. And what that leads me to think about many Ukrainians, and I wonder if I could get your response to this and your insight on this, is that if you're doing things like that, looking at maybe setting up trade or some sort of connection, as we talked about, or indeed rebuilding the day after you're hit by a drone, it leads me to conclude that at the core of many Ukrainians, obviously, there's a variety of people in this society, but there's a real beating pulse of positivity and a sense of future, and that someday this war will end, and that Ukraine's future will be better than its past because of it. I don't know if you kind of take the same stance, perspective from what I've outlined there, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you do get that sense, and when we visited Bucha, our experience parallels yours. We were amazed at the recovery. That recovery is largely, as you noted, due to the local population, right? So we're just going to take the bricks that were destroyed or make new bricks and get to reconstructing, right? And so part of that is could be a drive to your claim. So I have a destroyed house. If I just abandon it, if I leave it and just ask the state to help me, and I'm going to wait, somebody's going to move into that. Somebody eventually will take that spot over, particularly if it's a sweet spot near a town, near a road, near agriculture, etc. And so that. And so what you're going to do is get in there and rebuild quick, create facts on the ground. Oh, look, he's back rebuilding. It's his, right? And so that, in other scenarios, sometimes the more unofficial or undocumented your presence or claim is on a property, the quicker you want to get in there and create these facts on the ground, rebuild, in other words. Plant trees, plow a farmland. Oh, look, visibly they're back. That's a claim, right? You're making a claim there. And if you got no document to back you up, I don't know where my title is. My grandfather had the deed somewhere. We don't really have an official. You want to get in there and do that quick, right? So, but in Ukraine, you do see this broad can recover spirit, right? Very, very much. Part of it is not wanting to submit to Russia. Part of it is, they feel good about the direction their country was headed and is headed in terms of its development, its aspirations to join Western Europe, right? And so you see this, and it's I would say it's more than just we feel good about where we're going. It's like we are going to prevail here, and we are going to prevail in part because I'm going to rebuild my house too, even though it's just been struck, right? So that is a narrative that runs a little counter to what you can hear internationally, which is, why should the West fund large-scale rebuilding now? Because the war is still on, it just may get destroyed again. That's not a productive narrative, right? So that runs counter to a local population's thinking, I gotta live somewhere. I'm going to rebuild my house because it's been in my lineage or my family forever. I need a place to live. There's this sort of can do, and very tight knit self help, right? My neighbor helps me, I help my neighbor. There's a network there of self help that is also very powerful in having you rebuild your barn, your land, your farm, etc. So those are all big pluses, right? That happen on their own. When you see that go on its own with no international help, what we call that is administrative restitution. In other words, you go back, there's no counterclaim, fine, you get it. And so that can produce a document. So that sort of administrative restitution helps the person going back. So I go back. Everybody around me, of course, knows that it's my farm. They know me. They know I belong there, right? I have no documents. So internationally, you're good. And you can say, okay, here's your name. You have administrative restitution. There's no counterclaim. Here's your document, your provisional document. Well, now you've got a document, right? Where previously you didn't. The question becomes, from the international point of view, how many people can you put into that category of administrative restitution? You want that group to be as big as possible because that decreases the volume of your overall restitution problem, right? So that's, take care of the low-hanging fruit. And that's pretty good low-hanging fruit to take care of because it takes care of itself. You just have to make a document that attests to that, right? And then off you go to, as an international endeavor, to deal with the more difficult issues, right? Somebody is on your land. You do have land in Eastern occupied areas, and your difficulty is compounded. You're a renter. What are renters' rights in Ukraine if you've been dislocated? Question mark there. We need to sort that out legally. So there's a lot to pay attention to without making the volume of claims huge. So if you can decrease the volume by this administrative restitution, that's good all around, right? It decreases the problem.
Yeah.
Gets people back to their property quick.
Well, I'm gonna start to wrap it up here, but I'm gonna ask you the question that everybody hates when I ask it, because nobody has a crystal ball, nobody can predict the future. But as you look at the situation here in Ukraine, with all the topics that we have discussed here, whether it's reparations or land ownership or the situation with displaced people, where do you think this is going, and what are the things that you think should be paid attention to, either domestically or internationally, when it comes to Ukraine and a post-war Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it's as you say, difficult to have a crystal ball. I think that question focuses on the areas currently occupied by Russian forces. All right. So what is the fate of that area? Are you going to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, musical chairs, everybody stop? Right? Sort of, is it going to be a North Korea, South Korea? We're still at war, but there's this demilitarized zone. The guns are still pointing at each other, but there's no actual shooting. We've got a line there. Park it till the future. Cyprus is doing that as well. It's an ongoing problem. We don't know the solution. The border's there, and there you go. Let's get on with our lives. Okay, that's a scenario. There's a lot of, like in Cyprus and in the Koreas, a lot of outstanding issues. Well, I used to own property on the other side. Now what? I have a claim. Somebody owes me. Am I going to park the claim so that in 5 generations it's still going to be realized? You got a problem there because in 5 generations, of course, there's more people with skin in the game. All your descendants. That multiplies the people that now have a claim. So from a strictly restitution programming standpoint, you don't want that to go on. You want to handle the claims quick, because in a generation now you've got 5 children who are all pointing back to one property that their grandfather was dislocated from, saying, "Yeah, I got skin in this. I need a right." So that increases a problem. So coming up with a remedies, in the near term is to the advantage. Doing that takes a lot of machinery, takes a lot of operational, will, etc. But you can imagine a number of scenarios, coming to bear. The regime in Russia changes, they care less. Fine, take the Donbass back, or it's a referendum. This is a popular one. What do the people living there think? right? It is the case that the further east you go, the more Russia focused, Russia sympathetic Ukrainians can be, right? So the Ukrainians are not, of course, all of one mindset. No population is of any country. So would they vote to join Russia? Would they vote to not? Are they a real Ukrainian? Are they a Russian that's come in and pretending to be, all these things? It's tough to tell who's who.
Yeah.
If you do that, if you hold a referendum and play that game, but you could imagine that being a scenario as well, right?
Well, and it would have to be a referendum that wasn't at the end of a barrel like the Russians have done in the past as well. If you're going to have a referendum,
that is internationally observed, internationally supervised. Does it have legitimacy? A lot of questions there, right? That remains. So it remains to be seen. I mean, I think your question's it is the hot one. It does focus on the fate of current occupied areas of not just of Russia, but of its citizenry that it's kind of bringing in to take up residence there, right? So that's it. Kind of hinges on that and the willingness of the parties to play around with options there.
Yeah, well, regardless, it's going to be a very, very long, complicated, lengthy, process. No matter what it is. Professor, I appreciate your time. Before I let you go, is there any topic that I didn't ask you about that you would like to point out? Anything additionally you'd like to convey to my audience?
No, it's very wide ranging. So certainly appreciate that. I guess one thing that we're seeing that maybe is an opportunity is for subnational jurisdictions in Ukraine, a city, I don't know what you would call it, an oblast here or there, kind of having their own foreign relations activity go on. So you're seeing situations where one city will cut a deal with a Western country for reconstruction to happen just in that jurisdiction. Part of this is pressure.
Yeah.
Some Western European
see that a lot in Odessa. I see that a lot in Odessa.
Right, opportunity there. So there's money now in Western European capitals for reconstruction of Ukraine now. Please spend it. Well, we can't. The war's still on, or there's no national endeavor. We did find a town, however, that's willing to take, I don't know, Italian aid, German aid directly. And so the focus can be on a jurisdiction. So you can have what emerging, you just alluded to it, this patchwork of repair and recovery go on, right? Again, parallels this patchwork of different restitution efforts. I think a wise Ukrainian government would see that, encourage it, right? Allow it to go on. Try to regulate it, try to make it fair for jurisdictions that don't have that attention, but ultimately try to find a way to stitch it all together into one national program. So, part of it is, wars are messy. Post-war periods are extremely messy. What's there that you have to work with now, as opposed to trying to, assume you've got a blank slate or try to erase everything that people are already doing? What's going on now? And how can we encourage the positive aspects of that? So that's the big one, right? The one that you've observed in different places go on. So embracing that, I guess, would be a final word on my part.
Fantastic. And if you have any kind of links to your writings and the things that you put out and your opinions about what's happening here in Ukraine, we would certainly be happy to add it in the description below. And of course, if you've enjoyed our conversation, I'm going to take this opportunity to also request that you, click the subscribe button, maybe leave a comment on your thoughts about what we've been discussing. But Professor John Unruh, it's been a fantastic conversation. Merci beaucoup. As you're out there in Quebec, and I have found it very enlightening, and I hope my audience has as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Okay.